Hey guys, this is Robert Breedlove from the What is Money show. And as you've learned by watching this show, Bitcoin is the single most important asset you can own in the 21st century. And one of the most important companies in Bitcoin today is NYDIG. NYDIG's mission is to facilitate financial security for all. They accomplish this by bringing a high level of professionalization and sophistication to the Bitcoin marketplace. As a true game changer in the industry, NYDIG is safely unlocking the power of Bitcoin for forward-thinking individuals and institutions alike. By using NYDIG, you will gain access to an end-to-end institutional-grade platform, providing Bitcoin OTC transactions, Bitcoin collateralized borrowing, secure custody, asset management, derivatives, financing, market research, and more. And all of these services meet the highest regulatory, governance, and audit standards. Led by Robbie Gutman, Yin Zhao, and Ross Stevens, NYDIG has absolutely exploded onto the Bitcoin scene recently and is leading the way for ongoing institutional adoption in this nascent asset class. So please be sure to check out NYDIG as a single source for all your Bitcoin needs. Welcome back to the What is Money show. I'm sitting down today with Miss Kiara Bickers, who's a sysadmin at Blockstream and the author of a fantastic book. I'm really glad we're doing this interview because it's been on my reading list for a while, but I just kept rolling it back because sometimes you've read so much about Bitcoin, you think you know it all. Book is titled Bitcoin Clarity. And I think you did a great job, like I was saying to you offline before, tying in the fundamental aspects to the more meta aspects, and it's delivered in a very compelling way. So Kiara, welcome.
Hey, thanks. Yeah, no, I'm glad you see it that way. I think for me, I got interested in Bitcoin because of those philosophical aspects, but because I just got roped into Bitcoin early on, I just ended up on the developer track. And that really put me in the position to write this book and combine the two.
Yeah, well, developer track's probably a good place to start because it seems like more of the technically minded people saw the light first. Like I had this central banking kind of lens background, but it took me longer to get to Bitcoin as the answer to that. Whereas if you had the technical background, it seems like you guys were early to the party.
Well, I think the first chapter of the book, understanding why Bitcoin is trustless, really sets up for people to understand that's truly what got me to finally understand how Bitcoin was something different and didn't rely on a third party. I think there's so many buzzwords, and not just Bitcoin, but all of crypto in general. That's it's really easy to just get swept up in buzzwords. And I was just talking to a coworker of mine today, and he was telling me getting into Bitcoin today is not an IQ test, but getting into Bitcoin in the early days sort of was, because it was, there were a lot less resources back then. So unless you really understood how to code, I tried to learn about Bitcoin by learning how to code, which I talk a little bit about in the book and on podcasts and stuff like that. But that was kind of a hopeless endeavor. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend the learn to code thing.
Yeah.
If anything, there was one thing that I thought was really cool, which is the original Satoshi code, which is if you know basically any amount of programming, you'd probably be able to read that code, and it's much more it's a much smaller code base than the existing Bitcoin Core code base. So that was really cool when I discovered that.
Interesting. I don't even heard of that actually. What's it called? You said?
It's just called original Satoshi code. I think it's a couple of repos on GitHub. But that's where, I said, the first chapter of the book, which we were kind of talking about right now, is the idea of the blockchain as a time chain. Satoshi had actually written in a comment in that original code. So it's written in C++. It's only a couple files. And if you know a little bit about C++ or other languages that are similar, you'd be able to understand the full thing. Whereas for me, when I was going to the Bitcoin core code, which is what everyone runs when they run full nodes, that was just I don't know if there's a single person who understands the full stack of the code. So it's a beast.
Yeah. That's very cool. So you mentioned that it was the trust aspect of Bitcoin that was your aha moment. Was it the aspect?
Yeah, I think so.
Trust minimization, I guess, as you described.
Well, I like to think that there were a bunch of aha moments. I really I think like a lot of people, when I first heard about Bitcoin, I thought it was a joke, but that was like in like 2012 or something like that, like very, very early on. So I was interested in like the Liberty stuff, the Ron Paul stuff that was all happening at that time. But it wasn't like, when I understood that like Bitcoin was capped, that was like one big aha moment from just like a scarcity and sound money point of view. But when I actually started to get past just an economic understanding into like a developer understanding, really seeing how the blockchain has its own internal sense of time, and like that innovation was a big aha moment for me, because like when someone says trustless, like I'll put it another way, like Bitcoin is the way that you can send money securely over the insecure internet. And like, if you can, that sentence, right? It's the secure protocol over the insecure internet, like that is great. But then when you actually understand like how it works, you can kind of believe it a little bit more. And that's where the trustlessness thing comes into play.
Yeah. That's a great point. So and it ties to money as well, because, Szabo's work on money is like, we always favored the most trust minimized asset effectively to conduct trade with one another. So it's interesting how it all comes down to trust, right? In both the internet kind of sense of Bitcoin and the monetary sense of Bitcoin.
Trust is such a contentious word, because it's like, for people in business, they view trust as like a good thing. But when you look at like systems and security, trust is like it's more of a dependency and a risk. Whereas
right.
like the meaning is literally opposite in business. So it can be kind of confusing for people who are like new and trying to understand like the language of crazy security nerds.
Yes. Yeah. You lay that out well in your book too, that trust typically in your mind sounds like a positive attribute, like a good thing to have. You want to have that. But when it comes to systems architecture, you don't want to need to trust anyone, right? And nothing fallible. You made the difference between, was it risk and consequence? Is that how you broke it down?
Yeah. Actually, so I learned this from a rock climber, and I thought it was like a beautiful mental model. The idea of like, if you're going to climb, if you're climbing a rock wall, if you're going bouldering, like you could do a really hard climb that's not that far off the ground. So like, the actual effort is difficult, but the consequence is very low. Or you could do like 1,000-foot climb, like a free climb with no ropes, but like it's very easy. That is like, okay, the difficulty is low, but then the consequence is very high. That kind of thing is also is a very useful mental model for systems in general. Is like, okay, what's the actual context versus like what's the risk? The risk meaning the probability that something will occur.
Yeah, and then the consequence being the actual cost or damage incurred.
Correct.
Yeah.
Right, and that's just like that's being so specific with language, whereas like you usually don't need to be that specific in just like general conversation about things.
Yes.
But like when you're talking about systems, you have to like really define all of your terms.
Yeah, especially money, which is the most important system.
Right. And like when you, to bring it back to money, instead of just talking about like, the technical side of it, it's like, if you have some sort of hack in this money, like you could potentially actually inflate the currency that everyone's using. Right. So the consequence would be extremely high if there was ever a major flaw in Bitcoin.
Yes. And then, so is just talking about systems architecture in general, is it really focused on that expected value calculation where you're multiplying risk times consequence to get,
I don't know if you could actually assign a numeric value to any of those things. It's more of just people do try and like when you can actually, pay multiple security companies to give you a risk assessment, and they will assign a certain value to this, but it's pretty relative. Generally speaking, like the more dependencies you have, like, especially if you're not managing them, like the riskier that is. And, there's some organizations, like especially in traditional finance, where you just can't allow that. Like you have to control the operating system. You have to know and manage every single dependency. So the standard is really, really high, and Bitcoin needs to be higher than that. Right.
That's an interesting way to look at it. Maybe is it, so we want a money that has the least dependencies built into it, right? Or the least counterparty risk, as a finance guy might say.
And like the one dependency that most all software relies on is that those third-party clocks, and the third-party clocks, that being like a central point of failure sort of thing. Yes. Hasn't happened, but I think that was like I don't know if it was a concern in Y2K, but I think it might have been.
Yeah, for sure. It
And
definitely
that
was.
among a whole bunch of other things.
Yeah. So one of the things you did that was interesting in your book, or this black box structuring, where it's almost like you're zoomed out on Bitcoin and you're zooming into different parts to describe it. But to do that, to increase or decrease your resolution, sometimes you kind of just had to have the audience like just assume what I'm saying here. This is the input, this is the output. I'll describe to you later what the in between is.
That's
So
right.
I want to read this little excerpt just to kind of start us off. It said, quote, human pattern recognition is exceptionally good at using black boxes. We're all used to doing this because we're surrounded by black boxes all the time. We can't see someone else's intent. If you don't understand why someone is doing something or acting in a certain way, you can look at the consequences of their actions, which are the outputs of the system, and infer their intent from those consequences. So you're taking a very, I think in the psychological domain, they'd call this like a behaviorist viewpoint, where can't necessarily know the intent or motivation exactly, but you can just observe the behavior and the consequences. And you're doing that with a systems lens on Bitcoin. Like here's kind of what goes in and what comes
Yeah.
out, and then I'll describe to you later what's happening in between.
Yeah, like I'm trying to use an example that people can relate to, right? And like, yeah, that example, I think maybe even lawyers or people in that I don't know, industry could kind of relate to a little bit. Also, psychologists. But everyone, I think another analogy that I use is the idea of a car. Like I don't know how my car works. I've never built an engine, but I do know that when I step on the gas, like oil and air like combine, and then it moves me forward, right? Like that's enough. That's all I need to know. But generally, it's like a black box. So that's like a very common engineering term that is so beneficial for the average person to understand. It's just so useful because one of the things that happens when we start to talk about complex systems is there's just like this massive tendency to devolve into like trying to talk about different layers simultaneously, which is like not productive at all, right? So if we can just agree on the level that we're going to speak about the thing. So it's like, we're going to agree that we're going to talk about Bitcoin in the political sense and like the regulatory sense, or we're going to agree that we're going to talk about Bitcoin at the smart contracts level or the networking level, right? That's like different layers of the stack. And if I don't say that up front, or especially when I'm trying to explain something new to a user, because that's the target audience for the book, and maybe I shouldn't say new, but someone who's trying to understand the technical space. I think that black box thing is really helpful. Just say, hey, I know that you know a lot about this whole system, but let's just talk about this one part for now.
Interesting. Yeah. So you're defining, I guess, the bounds or the context of your description. So, and this is interesting too, because not only does technology, to your point, it evolves in layers. So you need to be very specific about which layer you're talking about. But this is biological too, right? You have to talk about life even evolves in layer. We can almost say technology is an extension of life in a lot of ways. What do they call it? The genotype is your DNA, I think, and then your phenotype
is the expression of the gene, right?
Yeah, your physical expression. But then they talk about your extended phenotype, which are like the tools you use in the environment. So,
that one's new to me.
There's just layers, right? It's just layers upon layers, layers.
I use an example because the idea of systems thinking can be kind of new to people, but I use that example in the book as well. Like I talk about the idea of like, okay, if you're going to talk about a human, like what level are you talking about a human at? Like, are you talking about it at the cellular level, at the tissue level, the organ level? Like usually we're talking about it on like the human to human, the consciousness level. But then so it's just like de facto, like we all understand that. It would be kind of weird to be talking about us in the context of like the atomic level. Like that wouldn't really make sense. So it's just like always implied. But with Bitcoin, it's just not that clear, right? Like you need to be like, like the idea of smart contracts in Bitcoin means an entirely different thing to almost anyone that you talk to outside of the like specific Bitcoin space.
Right.
Like people who want to like write business contracts on the blockchain have a totally different idea of what a contract means. So it's way too easy to get slipped up in terms, which is like what was really challenging about writing this and like trying to make all the mental models be the tools that allow me to like unfold things in different layers.
Yes. So especially when explaining a new system, precision of terminology is critical. And it's critical also to understand what layer you are in. Otherwise, you might analogize it to something else and get confused.
That's right.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. So then another thing, you're talking about people, even in antiquity, we thought like it's common to think today that people of the past were not scientifically minded whatsoever, but in fact, they were scrutinizing the black boxes all around them. I think you made the point that Plato thought light emanated from the eye.
That's right.
Aristotle.
I'm just like a huge history nerd. So like I love studying Greek history, and I really love trying to read the most original source that I can. Yeah. And I can't read Greek. So like that's a huge deficit. And you're losing all this information when you go from Greek to Latin to then English. So it's just like a huge bummer for me. But from what I can understand of the closest I can get to original sources, like nobody really understood what light was back in the day, right? So like the sun was like this huge mystery. Light was this huge mystery. They didn't understand photons. They didn't understand energy. They didn't understand like the relationship between mass, and like all that shit is so cool to us, but maybe we take it for granted. So it's not even that cool anymore. But like, to them, it was like, what is this thing? Like this black box. And it was, hundreds, if not thousands of years of playing with electricity to really understand like what light was and the duality of it. But I think that was scrutinizing black boxes for sure.
Yeah. So it's not that they were any less intelligent than us whatsoever. It's just that they had different black boxes than us, right? We've had more accumulated knowledge and different systems for understanding the world that turned some of these black boxes into white boxes, I guess, that just weren't available back then.
Yeah. And they had a different tool set for getting at these boxes, right? Like sometimes I think about just to the extent like how the actual language affected their ability to play with these concepts, because they were trying to talk about light at a time where like those words didn't exist. Yeah. And from what I could understand, like the meaning of light also meant like beautiful or to be admired. So like they were trying to use this concept of like beauty to impress upon their understanding of light, which is like incredibly challenging. Yes. And like you can feel this when we're talking about certain aspects of physics or certain cutting edge sciences. Like we literally don't have the words for this, so we're like struggling. Yes. It's like when you're pushing the boundary of like what we currently know, our current I guess boundaries of understanding.
Yeah, I think that they call this, I want to say it's the Worf-Sapir hypothesis or linguistic relativity, where the actual language you are thinking in influences the thoughts you can create. And they give all these different examples.
Yes.
Romance languages give you all these different gradations of emotional words that more reductionist languages, I might be using the wrong term here, but like Germanic and English would be more precise reductionist languages. Which
by the way, that was actually intentional as well. Like a lot of the development of the English language was intended, it was happening at around the same time as the early scientific revolution. The same people involved in writing the great plays, in the I guess you call them the Dark Ages, right? That or early Renaissance or whatever. Like those English plays were the same people who wrote those are the same ones who started to push at the Enlightenment era thinking and all the different experiments that were going on. And in comparison to like French, which was like the people who developed that language were really trying to make it beautiful for poetry's sake.
Ah, interesting.
So it totally different, right? And one of the problems I'm trying to figure out is like, how come the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution happened where it happened with the people that it happened with, and primarily like in English and German.
Interesting.
Anyway, that's a super fascinating thing to me, but basically I think,
to me as well. There's this I've been talking to a psychologist named John Vervaeke recently. He has this phenomenal YouTube series, which if you're a geek on Greek history and philosophy, you'll love it. It's like, I think he probably has 50 hours of content, and he's just a brilliant guy. But he makes this point. He uses the term psychotechnology, which I had never heard before. He talks about like literacy and numeracy being the most common forms, but how actual changes in that technology, it's like human software in a way. So we've had these software updates throughout history. And he talks about the axial revolution being one of the major ones where, Plato and Aristotle laid out new psychotechnologies like rhetoric. Rhetoric was a big one. And when we look at the printing press, for instance, in the 1500s, the reason it was such a big deal is because it accelerated the proliferation of literacy and numeracy. So it was a distribution technology for psychotechnologies, which is just like crazy.
It's crazy. And when you look into like the economics of all this stuff too, like Europe had largely rejected the use of paper because it was like a Muslim technology. And it wasn't until the printing press came into Europe that we were like, okay, I guess we'll use paper now, because it was like there was actual use case, right? It's endlessly fascinating, and like trying to understand like the origins of capitalism and even socialism to some extent, because they're all kind of percolating at that time. It's really difficult. It's such a fun thing to wrap my head around. But I'll have to check that guy out.
Yeah, it's really good. And then, you mentioned Europe rejecting the use of paper. I wrote some about this in the number zero in Bitcoin. They rejected the number zero, or the Hindu Arabic numeral system.
Of course, yeah.
They resisted it for a long time because it was ideologically misaligned with the church. Yeah. It didn't jive because the church had this model of the universe that was finite. Earth was at the middle. The church was dominant over the earth, therefore was dominant in the universe. And just the existence of zero, which seems so silly to us now, we're like, clearly that's a number. But back then, it literally shattered the whole thing because it implied infinity. And infinity did not fit into their, I guess, worldview or narrative, basically, they're using, right, to say the church runs things. So very fascinating how...
I believe, I'm trying to think back. The guy, I think, who like really popularized infinity, I'm forgetting his name, but I think he was from the Netherlands. So it sort of like it timed with the...
and that's where capitalism started, right?
Right. It was like sort of the Protestant rejection of the Catholic Church, because it was the Catholic Church that was really keeping everyone out of everything. They wouldn't even like let you read the Bible and anything other than Latin. So it's not that I necessarily agree with all the Protestants, but I'm saying it's not a coincidence that the Enlightenment happened at the same time as the Protestant movement was happening. It was because that was the time that you were finally not only allowed to do science, but it was like ordained by a king that you could.
Yes. And we had the software of it. So it's almost like the Enlightenment was this widespread implementation of a new psychotechnology. Like people are waking up like, oh, I can directly access the word of God using literacy. I can communicate and talk. And it's just so, and then that, percolates outward into institutional change. Because all of a sudden, it's like the church is not relevant to the person that can just read the Bible directly.
When I look at that time period when the religious wars in Europe were happening, I know, like 30-year wars and all these other wars, it's like the technology or the software that everyone was running was so heavily focused on like a specific version, a very narrow definition of what Christianity was, that like, of course, they were going to fight about it. But then once they started fighting about it for years and years and years, and they just kept fractioning off into new versions of what it meant to be Christian. They're like, okay, after like 30, 60 years, I guess finally got sick of it. And that was like when they're like, okay, it's not a good idea to fight about these nuances. We need to stop, because it was just like horrible. Like, you fight your entire life. You see your sons fight their entire lives. And eventually they were sick of it. That's their way of like purging that version of the operating system. Crazy. And then once that, maybe even just doing the update, right? So you do the update by having the wars, and then now you can kind of live in some semblance of peace and actually pursue things like science.
Yeah. Crazy.
Which all science means is like to pursue things that were interesting. Which is not what science means now. So now science is credentialism. So totally different.
Yeah. It used to be this natural philosophy in a way. And the other thing that's interesting there is that, so the software update that leads to Protestant Reformation, the Protestant work ethic, there's a lot of writing out there that's saying that was the basis of capitalism. It's like the fact that there was all of a sudden this ethic instilled in people to defer gratification, defer consumption, work hard.
It's so hard to pin my finger on this. I'm trying to figure it out, but like, from what I can tell, like the socialism side being, as the rejection of capitalism, it seems like the origins of socialism can maybe be pinned to the French Revolution, where, but they were rejecting private property, but not capitalism, because capitalism didn't exist, right? Private property was like, they're rejecting the king. So there's like, but if you look on Wikipedia, like all of these socialists that were around in the 1700s are labeled anarcho-communists, which is like, what? Like they're basic, yeah, they're like labeled as communists when communism didn't really exist yet. Like Marx hadn't even written anything.
Huh.
So I don't even know if Marx was born yet. So it was, yeah, it's really hard to pin my finger of like when capitalism started, because it's like, how are you defining capitalism? Like,
Right.
okay, like free trade and property rights, but for who? Is it when men were allowed to have property rights? Is it when women were allowed to have property? Is it like, I think the reason why a lot of people look at that Protestant Reformation is because that was when, well, a whole bunch of people died because of the plague, and like, you know, earlier than that. And then also, you know, pushing out the Catholic Church gave people some ownership of things. So that's my like very rudimentary understanding of the time period right now.
Yeah.
But I think that's about right.
Yeah. And it's, to your point there, this concept, which is really a social construct, sort of similar to money in a way, of property. It didn't just emerge as like, oh, like we take it for granted today, especially in the Western world. You just go buy a house or buy a car and no one's going to steal it from you. You know, you got a document that says it's yours, but it took it was a long, painful course to get there, where property used to be just the monarch had all the property and you worked for the monarch. Then there were, you know, you sort of had some property rights in some things, but not other things. And then there were still serfs.
And like all of the businesses started off as monopolies.
Yes.
It's like the Dutch East, whatever, India Company, like all of those major companies were like, the king said that you're allowed to exist and no one can compete with you. Right. And then we wonder why like they're the world's most rich like companies. It's because like they literally they had the monopoly of force behind them.
Yes.
For, you know, whichever kingdom they're a part of. But how you actually transfer that into America is where it's like super interesting, because the colonialists came over with money, right? And then they started companies, but there were no kings ever in America. So it's the transfer of wealth from Europe into America is a really interesting one to look back at.
Yeah. And it's a lot of the influence on the American Constitution was drawn from the Magna Carta, as I understand, right? Like life, liberty, and property. I know we perverted it to pursuit of happiness here, but
yep, I heard that one too.
Yeah, it's just interesting that and for me, it bridged the gap to, okay, we are experiencing the second order effects of technology and psychotechnology. Like that's what these huge revolutions and like, oh, the awakening. It's like, it's because we installed new software and then we, you know, a bunch of people died and then there were new people, basically a whole new operating system on humans. It's a crazy way to think about it, but it's so fascinating. It makes you wonder too, what black boxes we're operating in today. You know, we talked about light earlier, but we still don't know what light is, really. You know, there's this wave particle duality. If you get into quantum mechanics,
like, what
it
does
just
that
tells
even
you,
mean? Like,
it's like, we don't know what light is. I can tell you what it's like to interact with light, but that's it. So it's humbling, right?
Like,
it's humbling.
All of it is interrelated with mass. And you're like, okay, what does that mean? Like, so one of the things that I use in the book to structure it is not just the idea of systems thinking, but there's a hierarchy visual that I have in there because the whole thing's super illustrated. But I have this idea of like raw information is the base of the hierarchy. And then you have like knowledge, which asks how questions. And then you have wisdom, which asks why questions. And there's just like an infinite number of why questions that we just, you do not get access to.
Yeah.
Like human not allowed to interact with that level of information. Like, so one of the things, you know, trying to bring back to Bitcoin a little bit is like, when I was trying to understand Bitcoin, I was asking a lot of why questions. Like, why did people build this? Why does this exist? Why are things like this? And everyone would always answer with like, as if I had asked a how question. So like, well, this is the way full nodes and miners work. And like, this is the way the financial system works. Because that's like our default mode of answering things, because why questions are just really hard. You know, like, why is the sky blue? Like, no one can really answer that. They can tell you how it is, but not why. Yeah. And it's for natural philosophers, I think that can be a very frustrating thing. We just have to stay in our lane.
Yeah. The why question's trying to peer into the black box, right? What's the principle or intention or motivation behind this thing?
I think that's like the spark of curiosity that gets you looking. And like, ultimately, if all you can do is shake the black box and then see what's actually how it works, like it's sort of like a disappointing level of satisfaction, because you're like, oh, I know, you're like, I guess I know that light is this like wave and particle thing, but like that wasn't really what I wanted to know. Right. You wanted to know like deeper, like at the core, like what is the universe up to?
Right.
Like what are we up to? I don't know. It's like, it's really challenging to observe myself.
Yes. I think you did. I want to read another excerpt here, because you bridge these worlds nicely too, between like, I guess, artistry and philosophy and science in a way. So it says, you said, quote, "The physicists ask where symmetry exists and how it behaves, while the artists ask how they can recreate it, mirror it. If we could conceive of it, a complete study of symmetry would have to include both the sciences and the arts, and it would represent the human attempt to cultivate order, perfection, and connection in the universe. Artists see the world differently, and scientists think about the world differently." And the thought that emerged to me here was, have you ever seen the Overton window, where it talks, I don't know if I can do this justice, but there's a window, I guess, that most people have on reality. And there's certain things that are kind of at the edge of it. Like we could probably throw quantum mechanics there today. Most people don't understand at the quantum level, causality doesn't exist. Like it's all probabilistic and time.
Right.
Like there's all these weird things that we wouldn't normally
You can't
perceive.
know all properties of the system at the time. Like it's just nutty.
Yeah. So I think you're making the point there, which is a nice connection, that artists and scientists are really kind of doing the same thing, just in a different way. And that they're living
I think I learned this from studying Da Vinci. It's like, this guy was literally probably the best engineer of his era, but also one of the most beautiful, talented artists, that his work went into creating a lot of the medieval anatomy textbooks. Because I believe, and I haven't found the original source for this, but it's rumored that the Catholic Church wouldn't allow you to do cadavering of humans after they had died. Like
that's right.
So you couldn't study anatomy. That's, or at least if they couldn't do it, it was frowned upon. I don't know the technicals of this, but it was, eventually people started doing this again. And then we learned a lot about anatomy in that process. And so he was just, but like, I don't, as a modern person, I don't have a way to label him, because he wasn't a scientist. He wasn't just an artist. Like, how many artists that are engineers, right? Like we're so fractioned off in modern society. And it's like, the amount of times that I have to make the joke about like, oh, autism and stuff. And it's like, because everyone who's really technical they're so analytical, and everyone who's really artsy rejects anything remotely analytical. Yeah. And it's almost like we have these personality archetypes that are so distinct, and you're not allowed to be a mixture of both, because there isn't a place for you. Like you wouldn't fit into the economic cog of society anywhere. Like what role would you have? And except for maybe like you can kind of squeeze entrepreneur into that. But like, that's really tight. I don't know a lot of entrepreneurs that are doing painting and sketching. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah. Well,
there's just not enough free time.
Those are the Renaissance men or people, right? That these eclectically talented. Do you think that's a product of economic specialization? It's like we've just become so much more sophisticated that you have to focus on a smaller and smaller piece.
Maybe the actual, like the more accurate thing would be like the dominance hierarchy thing, right? It's like, how can men achieve status? Okay, they're not going to achieve status by painting pretty pictures, generally speaking, unless that's like literally the one thing that you're doing, and you go to like raves and then you print, you know what I mean? Like, and then you have an Instagram account, but it's really challenging. Like, I think back in those days, that was a way to achieve status. It was every cultured man must know an art, right? You must know how to play an instrument, and especially women, like you must know how to draw or how to paint. And that was esteemed. And that meant that you were part of society. And like now to become part of society, you go to college, you get the credentials, you get the second credentials. It's a totally different culture.
Yeah. Yeah. And I wonder, like, I'm always suspicious, and tying this back to the money in one way or another, like how much credentialism has been driven by the fiat currency complex. where you see things like Keynesian economic. I was reading a thesis the other day, the Keynesian economic thesis, and like they mathematize everything, but their underlying assumptions are so broken that the whole, like, it's a very eloquently written thesis, is 90 pages long. It's got all these formulas in it, but it's like your fundamental assumption that you can quantify demand, in this way, like, it doesn't work. So
great white paper is still a shitcoin. Yeah, it's. I think that is true. It's really hard to pin, though. I mean, certainly the whole, you can go to debt, you can take on debt to get the credential. That's definitely just pressing the gas to the issue. Yes. Right. And like, but culturally, the fact that we've accepted, you taking 3 units of an art class as being remotely similar to like actually knowing how to produce a beautiful painting. Right. Like that's just on us. Yeah. I don't know. Like, I don't know enough about how people earned a living back then to say how much of it is contributing by fiat.
Yeah. Yeah, it just seems like there's this other book I read about the philosophy of money, and it makes the point that the trade-off we get by distilling everything down to the price is we get massive data compression. So you're like, I know what a thing is. It's $80, right? You don't need to know much else about what happened behind it. But the trade-off is you then tend to reduce everything to a number. So you're giving up qualitative perception for quantitative perception in a way. And it seems like in the universities, that kind of just became the thing. It's like, here's the course. You want to get through it in the top 10% of your, like, everything's metric driven, data driven, number driven. But the qualitative, like in philosophy, for instance, if you go to university for philosophy, no one wants you to philosophize, really. They want you to study all the dead philosophers, be able to recite their ideas, pass the test, and then go get your job at Starbucks or whatever it is. Like, and so we lose that. We lose that whole element of ourselves, of our humanity. I don't know. Interesting to think about.
I think a lot of it, as much as I would like to pin it on money, I keep coming back to this part of the book where I talk about the double entry accounting and how it wasn't created by this guy, Luca Pacelli, this friar in I think it's like the 1500s in Florence or whatever. But this religious scholar basically is also running businesses, and then he's not the one who creates the idea of double entry accounting, but he's the first one to really popularize it. Mm-hmm. And I've tried to read as much of the original source on this, luckily, but it's in a book where the whole book is it's a math textbook, and there's only one chapter that's on accounting. So it's kind of like, who's the audience? Like the best I've been able to figure is that it probably was for students, but I would love to read the full book, but no one's translated the full book. So I can only read the one chapter, and the one chapter is his chapter on double entry accounting. But like when you see when you actually get the feel for how this man was, like, he took his religion so seriously that on every accounting book that he had, and he had to balance like 3 different books in order to make the system work, like it was always like the sign of the cross and like a prayer over it. Wow. And like this idea of ethics and it being embedded into the monetary system, and beauty being embedded into the things that we produce, like somewhere in the Protestant Reformation, like we lost that. Mm-hmm. And that's not necessarily to blame anyone. It's just what seems self-evident. And it's probably partially because of that reducing everything to a price thing, right? It's like we're so focused on the reducing everything to a price and efficiency. Like, of course, capitalism is efficient. No one can deny that. That we've lost the art and things, and art is inefficient, because that's not what it's about. To build a beautiful building is not about efficiency. To build a building that lasts hundreds of years has nothing to do with efficiency. Right. But it has to do with like having a life worth living. Yes. I hope in the Citadels we'll have this discussion, and the architects can input more thought into actually how we build buildings in the future. Because going to places like Canada where they don't have any, no offense to the Canadians, but it's like it's just everything is just so plain. Yeah. Like it's all built just for just copy paste the entire boat, same height. Yeah. Like,
a lot of that. Yeah. A lot of the architecture you see post 1971 is like that too. And Yeah, for all the marvels of efficiency, there's a trade-off there too, right? You lose, like, super efficient systems don't really have uh, fail safes and fallbacks, so they tend to be more fragile. And then that's on a numeric basis or a quantitative basis, but on a qualitative basis, they're just ugly typically, right? They're just stripped down bare bones. And there's something about that. Jordan Peterson talks a lot about the nature of beauty and how it, it's soul sustaining. There's something there that we get a window into the transcendent or something like that. And this if you go to, and it's interesting because Europe, where this is very evident, right? They've built these giant, beautiful 300-year cathedrals, and there's just so much.
You can't build anything
there.
New because there's all this old beauty. So you
yes,
have to kind of stay frozen in time,
which is inefficient, but it ends up being, I mean, people pilgrimage to Europe to go see this stuff. It's a huge economic boon forever. Basically, these buildings stand forever and everyone wants to go see them.
Profit off beauty. Yes, that's true.
So we've gotten, I don't know, we tried to over engineer ourselves or nature or something. And there's been a big loss resulting from that. Speaking,
I think, just to bring it back to the Bitcoin thing too, I think one of the things that's unique about looking at Bitcoin as a system is it made me feel the same way as like looking at, some beautiful architecture, right? Mm-hmm. You're just like, how much thought went into this system? Everything is so well, like the size of the transactions, like the efficiency of, it was like, for a modern person, you're like, look at this thing that's efficient and it balances like 30 different things.
Yes.
Right. So it's not only efficient, but it's just like it's the most beautiful, efficient thing that I can point to. Yes. Whereas like most efficient things is just not that exciting.
Yeah.
I shouldn't say that because
This is it's funny. You bridged me right to the next excerpt in your book, which is excellent. You said, quote, "I see Bitcoin as a system, and as with any good technological system, its goal should be to strengthen our connections as a small part of a larger connected whole." So I think this is a great instance of you tying in the systems thinking lens, which is very analytical and rational, but you're tying it back to the philosophical beauty side of it. It's like, if the thing is going to function well, it should make us part of this integrated whole. And like, not only should it function that way, but it should feel that way and appear that way. And, there's beauty in Bitcoin. And I guess you could say, if you've ever seen the supply formula for Bitcoin, which I'm sure you have, it's just this little mathematical formula. It shows a halving every 210,000 blocks. Am I saying, is that the right number? I'm not sure. And it just, 21 million hard cap. So it reminds me of looking at E equals MC squared. There's some elegance and simplicity there it almost invokes the same type of feeling as if you're looking at a beautiful painting or landscape. There's just something.
One of the things that I like to think about is like, what is like the difference between what is discovered and what is created. And I feel like this boundary of like science and art, like I should say the boundary, but where they intersect, like, is like, did we create the concept of zero or did we discover the concept of zero?
Right. Yes.
And if you were to ask someone this question, it would say more about them than it would about the actual thing that we're asking. You know what I mean? Yes. Because you're saying, are you left-brained or are you right-brained? And, a kind of broken mental model. But like when it goes to like E equals MC squared, like that was something that was in my mind that was discovered. But then when you look at Bitcoin and you say this 21 cap and the scarcity, it's sort of both, right? Because it's certainly true that people value scarcity, and like then we create the digital representation of that.
Yes.
It's just mind blowing at a couple of different levels there.
I love that you brought up zero because it's one of my favorite. It's the closest analogy I think I've found for how big of a deal Bitcoin is. It's like when we figured out zero, it changed effing everything. That's right. But it's unclear, to your point, whether it was an invention or a discovery, because are numbers real? I mean, are they? What do you mean by real? Certainly numerals, which are like our symbolic representation for number, that's something we invented, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever that is. And so zero in that sense was just an invention. Someone figured it out. But when you trace it back, it came from an Indian mathematician named Brahmagupta, I think his name was. And he says he discovered zero in meditation. It was the experience of shunyata, which means nothingness, right? It's to transcend duality and be in this place of no time, no space. That's where he found or discovered zero.
That's beautiful.
And then he just represented it with the numeral zero. And then it's like, okay, crazy meditating guy, like use whatever numbers you want. But then that numeral system conquers the world because it gives us,
right.
And
it takes hundreds calculus, of years because the Indians didn't have paper.
Yeah.
Right? It's like the Muslims have to conquer them with the paper. And it's like, when you look at like the spiritual experience, and then you look at like how the meat space interaction, like how to actually how do you propagate information in meat space? It's like people have to conquer other people and then discover this thing like written on a rock, and then ask all the locals, like, what is this zero? And like, oh, that's useful. And then you finally get someone who's open-minded and willing to adopt it. And not until they get conquered do then we adopt. It's like, it's almost like the wars have like, it's like something beautiful could come out of the wars. It's like we're progressing humanity towards the understanding of the knowledge of zero and spreading that knowledge.
Yes. And it's, as people awaken to the benefits it affords them, right? Specifically with zero, you could just do calculation faster, easier, cheaper, more accurate, right? It was a better psychotechnology at the end of the day.
Right. The placeholder was great.
The people that adopted it outcompeted those that did not. And at the end of the day, here we are. We all use zero. So it's like the same thing. I don't know if it's the same thing. I argue that it's similar to Bitcoin and that everyone wants 0% inflation money. Clearly, who doesn't want money that doesn't fucking steal from them? It's obvious. Excuse my French. And people will just voluntarily adopt it. And those that adopt it will outcompete those that do not through a similar process as gold monetized. And that's it. That's the whole game. That's how Bitcoin eats the world in a nutshell, just like zero. So
I mean, I don't know how long it took for the actual adoption of zero, but hopefully it's faster for Bitcoin.
Yeah, it was a bumpy road for a few hundred years, but the information systems were much less interconnected back then, much slower, Okay, I want to do another excerpt here. You just had so many lines in your book. I was highlighting like crazy. Okay, tying it back to art and science, you said, unlike other explanations of Bitcoin, which can read like a dry textbook explanation of the protocol, I view Bitcoin as both an art and a science. There's a science to know how it works and an art to seeing the beauty in it. And that's a great line encompassing your book, I think, because you really get to the science of Bitcoin throughout, but I don't know how much effort you put into editing and proofreading this, but it's displayed in a very artful way. And that sentence is a great example of that. So, yeah,
I mean, I'll just tell people a little bit about the process, but like I said, I was interested in Bitcoin because of economic reasons. Like I was very liberty minded, and I had this very narrow view of like what I thought sound money was. And like, it wasn't until I started working in the space, specifically working alongside some of the core devs and like the Lightning devs at Blockstream, that I started to see the way they thought was very different than the way I thought, because they had my operating system for sure, but then they also had all these other layers that I had no knowledge of. And this is, I have this towards the end of the book, but like the concept of like the unknown unknowns, right? Like I would have never known that I was missing this level of understanding, because like, what am I going to do? Google it? Like, Google, tell me all the things I don't know about Bitcoin that'll make it beautiful. Like that, you know what I mean? Like, that's just, you can't do that. So it wasn't until I had that human interaction with people who were like putting their lives, investing it into developing the thing. At the time, there was like no money in that as well, right? So that I started to understand like, oh, there's like the security aspect of systems is beautiful. Like that's the honest to God, the way that I think about it. And for sure, if I said this to them, they would think that I'm nuts, because they don't think like this at all. They think very analytical. But it's just like melding the way I think with the way I think, my rough understanding of the way developers think, and then packaging that in a way that is like not Bitcoin for dummies at all, but is like Bitcoin for people who want to see the beauty in it and who are like actually intelligent in a different lane of life, like one of the biggest problems I had with all the Bitcoin explanations I was seeing is like, not only is it overly analytical, but it either dumbs it down or it's like way too complex. It's like, where's the middle ground? And I think the middle ground is combining like, analogies, systems that you already understand, bringing in like real world examples. And, I'm not an artist, but part of the process that I had for writing the book was I was determined to never use a visual that had already been used, because all of the visuals to explain things like UTXOs, they're taken from like the literal BIP, like the Bitcoin Improvement Protocol, and then included in the explanation that's meant for a non-technical audience. Like, it's so not helpful. So anytime I had an idea of like, oh, this is the way I'll explain this, I would sketch it out on note cards and it would just look like garbage, and then I met this guy at my local coffee shop who was just like making these beautiful little like pencil sketches of rivers and like whales. And I was like, hey, like, do you think you want to sketch out this book for me and just like make my drawings better? And that worked out great. So like, yeah, the book is super illustrated, and I hope that it really is a combination of science and art, because I tried to get this artist to like understand what it was I was trying to explain in the diagram, and then he just like turned it up a notch.
Wow, that's so interesting.
He doesn't do technical shit at all. He doesn't do technical drawings for anything else.
Yeah, the illustrations are gorgeous. I mean, they're simple, they're elemental, they're even like you were talking about the knowns and the unknowns, and you use the yin yang symbol, right? And you describe how the different components of it, and that resonates with me a lot. So I mean, clearly I came into it as a reader that considers himself I understand Bitcoin pretty well. I mean, I've read a ton about it and studied it a lot. I still just enjoyed it. I just enjoyed the process of reading the book because it was put together in an aesthetic, digestible form. So you mentioned your writing process. I do want to talk to you about that, because I think you've probably got some good pointers for people like me and maybe a lot of others. What did you do? How did you do it? What was your rhythm?
Yeah. So I mentioned the note cards, and I think that was probably the key to it. Well, I think so. I have like 2 different books that I want to write. And every time I have an idea for the book, I just jot a note down like in like Evernote, or I shoot it to my email or something like that.
So these aren't index cards. These are
software?
So
when for years, I draft the book through just scattered notes. Right. Okay. And then when I decide to actually make it a book, like, okay, I'm going to start writing now, then everything gets put into note cards. Okay. And then once I have all the note cards, then I'm like, okay, now I'm going to be a writer instead of just like a note taker. And then that's when I start to like have you have to get, you wake up early, you set a time, and then you just commit to writing a certain amount of words per day, and you understand that they're going to be garbage. Yes. Like, it's just total garbage. And you accept that, and you try, because I'm a very judgmental person. Like, I have a hard time turning down my judgment. So it can be really hard to write and edit at the same time. Like, I don't recommend it. So exactly, whatever you have to do to turn that judgmental part of your brain off. And for me, it's like waking up early, so I only have the energy to do one thing. So you try and write in a non-judgmental way, using the note cards, because the note cards allow you to like put the book in order, and that laying out the book in order is maybe one of the most important parts. And then I try and write, and then you spend twice as long as you spent writing on editing, and then it comes out less bad than when you started. So
wow,
that's hopefully the goal.
And then your editing process, that's just you personally refining your own writing.
Yeah, so I did a little bit of editing. Like, I asked people to edit, and when people are doing you favors, it's probably best that you don't ask them to edit a whole book. So I think in the future, I'm just going to ask particular people to edit particular chapters. Yeah. And, there's a whole bunch of problems with having people edit your book, because they change your language, they change your style. They don't like little things. And like, I like my writing to sound like the way that I talk. I don't want it to sound like the way like Ben over in like BD talks. You know what I mean? Right. Because it changes the tone. So, but I mean, it's always good to have feedback, and people will tell you things that I think are useful. They're asking them to edit your book for a reason. So I did that. And then after I had like a collaborative editing session with some people that I thought would have good feedback, then I sent it to like a proper editor who he was allowed to critique my style, and that was fine.
Gotcha. Okay.
But I don't know. Writers are particular,
Tell me about it. What? How was the total time? So you spent like 6 months notes, 3 months writing, 6 months editing. Like, what did that look like?
Yeah, I think it was like a little over a year.
Okay, the whole thing.
A little over a year. I was writing that from like the 2017, 2018 kind of time. And then I kind of pushed it out in 2019. And then I try and redo and edit and update the book pretty regularly, because there's some things that will get changed and I'm like, oh, I don't want the book to be technically wrong. So then I'll like go back and change it. It's like, I know during COVID, they like changed the fractional reserve banking requirements. So like instead of 10%, it went to 0. And I was like, now this makes my book inaccurate. So I have to go back. Or like when all the miners are pushed out of China, like I still have to make that update. That's just the analytical side of me. You don't want to be technically wrong. But yeah, it's that's not really the stuff that matters, right? It's the overarching points that matter.
All right. So let's jump into Bitcoin as a clock, which I think this is a very important way for understanding Bitcoin, actually. So I'll read an excerpt here. You said, a clock is a system that is regulated by its internal structure to keep time. The blockchain is a clock that's regulated by its blocks to keep time. It's because of this system of self-regulating timestamps that Bitcoin possesses its own internal sense of time. So I think it's very profound, maybe to understand, but this idea of creating your own time, it marches by the beat of its own drum almost. And that's what because it's independent of every other timekeeping factor in the world. It sort of forces everyone to march by the beat of its drum over time. And one other, I'll mention this too, where you tied this in historically. You said, out of either ignorance or corruption and disputes between churches, more than a few Roman politicians added days to the calendar to extend their rule. Considering the average lifespan of a democracy is only 200 years, the Western world is overdue to overturn this cycle of democracy. Historically, inaccurate timekeeping has been a measure of incompetence and corruption. And with the invention of Bitcoin, we have a way of keeping time that relies on no one and trusts no one. So it really, I mean, this idea of, money and time, this connection between them is very, very deep. And this idea of power as well, I think was an interesting one to tie in, that rulers have actually manipulated our timekeeping systems to their own benefit. But in Bitcoin, we have an incorruptible time system.
It's legendary. It's legendary. And like when I go back to the origins of what the calendar is, it was originally called the calendrum, I believe, and maybe I'm obviously pronouncing it wrong, totally butchering it, right? But the idea was it was the ledger in which you stored the dates for payments. So like in the original calendar, there were always dates for payments. And then we abstracted that and made the calendar just like this plain thing where you could put like where you go to the gym on it. But like that's not, it was always linked to payments from a historical standpoint. And then from the Roman senators extending their rule by adding days to like random months. And it took Julius Caesar coming in and saying, okay, like I'm going to play dictator and clean house a little bit. Like it took that moment in order to clean up the calendar. And obviously we don't have problems like that in the calendar now, but there's all kinds of different schemes that go along with messing with time. And it's a really underrated part of Bitcoin's level of security. Like the developers of Bitcoin have thought about security to the extent that it literally does not trust any third-party sense of time, which right off the bat is not true for basically any other blockchain, because there's a lot of problems when you speed up the block time. It means that you end up having to check that third-party sense of time more often, because it's impossible to have a really distributed system. When people read the book, it's a little bit easier to explain, but basically like, because the nodes are distributed all over the world, it takes literal time to propagate that information. And the perfect number, at least, right now with current technology, is about 10 minutes for block time. And that's what was chosen for Bitcoin. Yeah. if you go faster than that, it means that you have to check a second party source of time, which is then, a centralized point of failure or some sort of corruptible thing that could basically wreck your payment system. And by wreck, I mean not allow you to put payments in order. Like that would be bad.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's such a, I didn't know that about the origins of the calendar, but when I was looking for a comparison to Bitcoin to try to describe how profound of an innovation it is, calendar was one that I evaluated because it too is a social construct, kind of like money, but it's a very important technology. And then money itself too has kind of this timekeeping function in a way. If you look at, like the proof of work associated with gold, we knew the supply could not increase over a given percent over a given time, or we had high assurances. So it was, and then money itself is like a reflection of our time in a way. It's like how much productivity have you added to the marketplace? You've been rewarded in money, and then that money can be used to claim the time of others as a claim.
That's right.
Not a claim. Someone corrected me on this earlier, as a call option effectively on that productivity. It's not a legally binding thing, but you can use it to redeem the productivity from the market. So there's this deep relationship between money and time. And hence the reason or the incentive to try to control either.
This is also why usury was considered such a condemnable thing, right? Is because if money is a reflection, if money is stored time, not even just stored value, but just stored time, like a laborer's time in a physical form that they can then redeem, right? Like if that's what the purpose of money was from at the ethical level, then to profit off of it without investing any time would obviously be corrupt, right? So now it's like when we go back to the issue of capitalism, it's like, obviously, I think capitalism is good and has many positive things, but I think you'd have to be blind to ignore some of the negative things, which is like, this whole number go up mentality is like, what can I buy where number go up and I don't actually have to invest any time in it? I'm not saying that would be, I'm not necessarily condemning people for doing that because it's in their best interest, but it just shows like the degradation of societal values. It's like all of the tools that we have to make money that require you invest time in them are bad. They're not in your interest. Like it's good for you to invest in things that don't require your time. And there's so many options like that available. But it is it feels a bit dirty.
Yeah.
To just capture value in that way.
Yeah. To capture a call option on time when you're not investing any time, right? There seems to be something asymmetric there. I did talk to one guy, he's a Middle Eastern guy, and he knew, usury is condemned in the Quran as well. But he made the point that presupposed a hard money standard. So when someone borrowed from you and they borrowed gold, presumably, and they paid you back in gold, there tended to be this implicit interest rate built into it because, if an economy is advancing 2 or 3% a year on average, then clearly this is not a universal rule. This is just kind of a tendency that money tends to appreciate in tandem with the productivity growth, right? Again, if money's a call option on all the capital, then as the capital stock and the economy grows, the money appreciates a little bit. So he was just making the point that there was this implicit or this implied interest rate, this implied yield on borrowing and hard money. And that's why they forbade usury on top of that. But clearly, when you get into fiat money, that's not the case at all. Like the money, it's actually the opposite, right? You need to charge, if you're going to have a profitable borrowing business, you need to charge very high interest rates to cover the inflation plus
right. It's like, I don't even know what you call what's happening now. Like, I don't know if you call it usury because it's like interest rates are low, right?
Yeah.
It's like literally it's just like fake money. And that's not exactly the same thing as usury. So if you are willing to expand your definition of usury, then this is almost like this would be a worse sin in my mind.
Yes.
Right. But that's not the way that it was talked about in a historical sense. So yeah, I don't know. You enjoy thinking about the ethical issues of money, right? And this is one that I've struggled with, is like, okay, so we have this like more ethical form of money, but it also has these weird properties of like, you don't actually have to do, like, you don't have to do anything of value to make money off of it. You just have to be alive and like have a pulse and then be lucky and take a bet on this thing. And that's why you can see like in the, you know, people who like to talk about the ethics of money, kind of people like us, maybe we don't readily point out the fact that there's like a bunch of people who don't treat Bitcoin that way. Like, I'm not articulating myself clearly. What I'm saying is like, there's so many people who just buy Bitcoin, not because it's ethical money, but because it's just number go up.
Of course.
Right. And like, that's actually probably the loudest portion of the community. So it can be challenging to propagate this information out because, you know, we're competing with a money printer who owns like all of the journalists on this matter. I mean, how many journalists do you know that are getting paid in Bitcoin?
Yeah. It's, you know, human's gonna human, I guess, is you might say. And it's also like, there's no absolutes. There's not like someone buys an ethical money and all of a sudden they're an ethical, perfect human. There's all this confluence of factors thrown at us all the time. And really, you could argue the number go up of Bitcoin is really just a reflection of dollar go down largely. I mean, granted, it's not just that. Yeah. It's not just dollar go down. It's also people saying, clearly, this is a better tech. I'm going to use this. But we still face these, or we still are exposed to the influences of the dollar and the fiat system, right? I'm in this Bitcoin and Bible book club, and we talk a lot about this. It's like, okay, is taking for instance, the U.S. government's been throwing out all these loans to everyone that has a pulse over the past year, right? Small business loans, this loan, that loan. Okay, is it unethical to take that loan? I mean, it's basically free money. Some of it is actually free money. They're like, fill out this loan application and then fill out the loan forgiveness. And then that's that. You just benefited directly from the teat of the U.S. government, Federal Reserve banking system. It's just murky, like, where do you draw the line? Another thing, Bitcoiners really want to condemn people for shitcoining. It's like, okay, how many of you guys use dollars? I mean, you're all shitcoining.
I've always thought like, well, I mean, to have to make money off of a shitcoin to buy more Bitcoin, like it's literally the way most of the mining operates, right? Is like, like there's some software that's optimized for mining whatever the most profitable shitcoin in that moment. And then like on the back end, like that's exchanged for Bitcoin. Like to say that that's unethical, like there's this really great play by, I think it was the first play by George Bernard Shaw, but I can't remember what it's called. And like the whole premise of the play was there's this guy who's the landlord who's owning this like disheveled building. And then there's like the ethical guy who's like way above it. And then he finds out that he owns like a share in that business or whatever. So he's technically an owner of this like disheveled building, and he's been living off of the stipend or, whatever payout. And it's so interesting because people will go into that play and see totally different things. Like some people will go into that play and say like, oh, well, capitalism is this horrible, like unethical thing. And like, I go into it and I see like systems are so complex that it's actually unreasonable to attempt to reason about certain things. Like something like the taintedness of your money or the taintedness of how you're earning an income, because it's just the economy is so intertwined. It's like we're all participating in this culture. Yeah. And I don't know how we dial it back. Like it's really easy to criticize modern culture, but like how do you change it? And maybe we're trying to do that with Bitcoin to some extent and trying to see beauty in things. But how do we take it to the next level?
Yeah. Well, it's a rabbit hole in and unto itself. And when you consider, why the US dollar is the US dollar, right? For a number of reasons, World War II being one of them, Bretton Woods being one of them, the fact that it was once redeemable for gold, there was a bait and switch on it. Like there's all this history of fraud, deception, violence, like baked right into your money. You can't ignore it or erase it. And then it's like, you're playing a part in that. Whether you want to admit it to yourself or not, like you go to the store and put a $5 bill on the counter and buy your coffee, like you're still partaking in that. You were contributing to the reservation demand for the US dollar that enables the entire system to operate. So it's not like a fun thought to have, but it is real. And I guess to your point, it's very tricky to disentangle ourselves from the complexity of all of this. It's like we're wrapped up in things in a lot of different ways that we hardly understand.
That's right. And then that's like when you're looking from the present into the past, but like then when you look into the present going into the future, it's like a whole set of other issues. Like one of the things that's blown my mind about the way the Bitcoin Clarity book was received was a lot of people really like the chapter on governance, which is like, I mean, the content that's in that book is like, I try and compare the way laws are produced in our democratic republic and then compare that to like how code changes are made in not just Bitcoin, but like any open source code base. Like the process is somewhat similar. And, you know, I talk about a couple different things there, like the legislative angle. But in particular, I talk about how like this technology called the blockchain is a way to have immutable data. Like that's it. That's the end of sentence. This blockchain is a way to have immutable data. And we don't actually know the implications of all of that.
Yes.
Like I love to play around with as much AI as I can, like the stuff that's actually like available to the public. And it's like officially good now. Like the AI is now really, really good. 2 years ago, I would have told you it was garbage. And like now it's amazing. For a whole month, I had the like GPT-3, which people may or may not be familiar with, but GPT-3 is just like this text-based kind of AI neural network thing where you give it an input and then you stipulate what form you want the output in and it'll give it back to you. So I had this AI thing, like read all my tweets and then produce more tweets. And then I would tweet all the tweets that the AI tweeted and like nobody knows the difference. Like it's provable. Yeah. And like everyone thinks that that's me. And it's just like Bitcoin ramblings and like random philosophical thoughts about the nature of the universe, like whatever. And like, yeah, I thought they were so good. It's like, whatever, I'll post that. And it was such an interesting experiment because it's like, okay, now AI is so good. That jump from GPT-2 to GPT-3 is so big that like GPT-2 was allowed to be used publicly and then GPT-3 is like not. Like you have to be an academic or like a government or China or something. Like you have to, yeah. So like you can't, it's really challenging to get access to it now, but I played around with it for a little bit when it was first like new, and the amount of content that you could create, like I could just spin up like thousands of people with a quote unquote opinion instantly, and they would all be in a conversation with each other and then be evolving the dialogue together. And then you as a real person are sitting on the internet looking at this conversation thinking that this is a real thing, but it's just like, you know, like a neural network running on someone's server, like at MIT. And I don't know if we fully understand the implications of this tied to the fact that we have this immutable database thing. Like, I don't know, like it's so complex that I can't even walk out how the future will look. You know, like one of the things that blew my mind was I before I got into Bitcoin, I actually thought I was going to study like neurobiology or something like that. And I was following like in the San Francisco, biotech was huge in the early 2000s. And then it kind of like didn't deliver on all the promises that we kind of thought we were going to get out of it. But I think it was in Japan specifically, they had removed legislation that made it illegal to try and mix the animal and human DNA and like produce, I don't even know what you'd call these things. There's a word for it, but like, who knows what that is, right? So like the fact that they removed this law to now allow experimenting with creating half human, half other animal concepts.
Wow.
Like then you have to assume that they're doing it, right? So it's like, you look at the cryptocurrency realm, we're still talking about Bitcoin, but it's been like a decade now since Bitcoin was created. And then it's like, you look at the AI realm, we don't even, it's so scary. They're not even giving that access to the public. And then for the biotech realm, I'm pretty sure it's so ethically concerning that none of that can ever be published ever. Like so I don't need like however the scientists are propagating information in that industry, like who knows, right? It's just backdoor dealings all the way. But yeah, it's crazy to me. And maybe to bring us back to our conversation about like the Protestant Reformation and all this stuff, it's like we're still arguing about like, you know, I don't know, like social media or something totally stupid when like the real fight is like on the edge. of like what technology allows us to do. And like all of us are too distracted with like politics.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know. It's just crazy stuff. COVID.
Yeah.
Right. So it's that won't be the actual issue when you 100 years from now, when you're looking at this timeline. Like how often do you really even, when you're looking at history, do you even care about the different, what do you call it? The different,
pandemics.
The different pandemics that occur. Like everyone forgets about the pandemics. When you look at World War I, you forget that more people died in the pandemic after that than World War I.
Right.
Right. So maybe this isn't even the real issue.
Well, man, you bring up so many crazy points there. When we get into AI and these biological hybrids, I don't even know where that goes. That is just too mind blowing for me to even try. And I focus on the first thing you said, like this idea of immutable history alone, where if we can now record things with permanence, essentially, right? If you, we take this interview that we're doing, if we then put that on a media platform that's built on top of Lightning Network that's anchored to the Bitcoin blockchain, then I guess in theory that thing is there forever, so long as Bitcoin is there. Maybe I'm overstating the technicals a bit, but that alone seems to have profound implications. Like, what if we could just pull up Zoom chats of Plato and Aristotle right now and see what they were, how different would the world be, and what kind of a psychotechnological update would it be to have something like that available? How much will that technology or psychotechnology influence our evolution? That alone completely blows my mind. But then when we start playing God, that is truly scary to me. It reminds me of that quote, humans have prehistoric emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology, something like that. So we're just this.
Oh, I love it.
We're just a mess inside,
Right.
So I want to get back to you. There's another great excerpt in your book here. An alternative theory for the evolution of money that there is actually evidence for, and this is contrasting it to barter, I believe, is that money is a social technology that evolved out of our moral and selfish desire to track debt. From the ancient accounting tablets of Uruk in Mesopotamia to the tally sticks used in Europe during the Middle Ages, there is a growing body of evidence to support the theory that money evolved as a formal system of reciprocity. And then you go on later to describe the dollar in one of the most epic sentences I've ever read. At worst, the dollar is a promissory note that promises nothing. So, did you get this? Was this from Graeber's book, Debt 5,000 Years, where he's arguing that it was debt, not barter, that was the original form of money?
I've read a bunch of books, and that was probably the most influential on that topic. Yeah, that one for sure. That was a great book.
Which makes sense, because like in a small village, we probably started trading IOUs first, right? Like, hey, I'm going to have a few apples and I'm going fishing later. Like, mind if I pay you back? It just makes sense that people would start trading favors.
Yeah,
first.
I think a good way for me to understand it is like, obviously barter existed. Like, no one's saying that barter didn't exist, but barter is barter. Barter isn't money. And like, when you start to write down debt, like now you have a record.
Yes.
And like, that's much closer to what the origin of money than what barter is.
Right.
And like, to say which comes first is like, well, who really cares? Like, who cares?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
But to your point, debt's more scalable, right? Because you can have it's informational. Barter is very not scalable for all the obvious reasons, but debt is just you're tracking a ledger, and then it's how best to track the ledger.
What frustrates me about the barter school of the evolution of money is like, they make it sound as if like people were like, oh, this barter is really complicated, therefore let's create money. And like, that's not how it happened, right? For sure. Because like, people just aren't that, I guess, intelligent, to be honest. Like it took a lot more effort than that. I wish it was that simple, but it's like not at all. Yeah, looking into the tally stick form of money in the Middle Ages is super crazy too. People use all kinds of stuff for money, I think that the evidence for it coming out of debt is way stronger than it just like magically arising out of barter.
Yeah, and so then gold fit into that picture as just well, Austrians would say the most saleable good, but it really was just the instrument that was most widely accepted in the satisfaction of debts in a way. So this is where people get really tangled up in this argument. Well, then, gold's not money. It's just used for satisfying debt. But one of the definitions of money is that which extinguishes debt. So
what a useless conversation that sounds like. Yeah.
This gets into, there's a bunch of these statist guys that will tell you gold's not money. It's never been money. I'm like, what do you mean? I'm like, does it satisfy debt? Like, yeah, and that's all it's for. I'm like, then there's money. What are we talking about here?
I don't know. It sounds like someone's trying to win an argument. And
yeah.
I don't think they're winning anyone over here.
A lot of people out there trying to win arguments these days. All right, one more excerpt to round us out. So you said that a strong government will always decouple itself from a hard currency because it has to, if not at once, slowly. The currency is devalued with cheaper metals until the money, like dollar bills, it is no longer backed by scarcity at all, but only the full trust that the state and its empire will remain in power. I've described gold in particular this way, that it was the original governor of governments, actually. Like if you misbehaved as a governor, you printed too much money or you abused your people, like gold would flow out of your country or your organization for that matter. And ever since we've, broken that or moved away from that as a monetary system, it's been this rampage of irresponsibility, I guess you would say.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the way that I think about it, I think about everything as a system. And it's like, for me, I look at history and I see all these small states valuing gold because it's sort of a way to prove their trustworthiness and credibility. But the nature of the game is like, once you're the omnipresent government, like once you're the strongest and most powerful government in the world, or like in history, like the Roman Empire saw, or like America has seen, then it's sort of like, why do you need this thing that's holding you back, right? Like the nature of systems is that systems are designed to grow. Like every organization's job is to grow. The government's job is to grow. Any libertarian that is trying to use the state to shrink it is doing it like against the nature of the system. That's not what systems do. Organizations, like, what does every startup try to do? They try and they sell to the next round, right? So when you have that understanding in mind, it's like, I don't blame, I guess I don't blame governments for decoupling from gold, because it's like, it's literally what has to occur if you're going to grow. Right. Now that's obviously corrupt and we can criticize that, but like, whose fault is it? Like, one of the things that I've been thinking about recently is like, it was like Nixon who took us off the gold standard, right? Yeah. It's like he was in such a pressed position that he had no choice. So it's kind of like, whose fault was it, right? Or it's like, if we were to argue about who should be in office, my guy gets in the office over your guy, and he can only achieve like 10% of the things that he said that he was going to achieve. Well, it's like, it's like, even when you obtain the highest seat of power in this huge system, you're still totally like handicapped as to like what you can actually do, because there's no seat in the entire system that allows you to control it. In a way, it's like there's decentralization within the centralization. There's no seat of power inside of the US that would allow you to completely change the US. That just does not exist. Yes. So we have to just ride the system, which is also why there's no culpability of like using the dollar, because we sort of feel like, well, I didn't do it and I can't stop it. But everyone says that because it's true. Nobody can stop the dollar. It's just, it's so big now. So yeah, I think that's an unfortunately true statement, that like, I love the way that you think about gold. And it's just unfortunate that we don't know how to build systems that will never scale. Like, how do we cap political systems and not allow them to grow any further? I think we tried with America, but I don't think that succeeded. Yeah. Yeah. So in a way, systems are always trying to overcome their own boundaries. But these are these constraints at least make them viable initially, right? Like a government needed gold to scale itself into existence. But then when it reaches this critical mass, it wants to
cast off the yoke of gold and go a different direction.
Yeah, and if you're looking at the world not from an ethics point of view, but simply from the point of view of the success of that system,
Right.
It's definitely within its interest to do that.
Yes, but it is also inherently corrupt because you're basically defrauding the users of the monetary system, right? Everyone's circulating this paper and you're like, oh, this is as good as gold. And then one day it's not all of a sudden.
I guess what I'm realizing in this conversation too is like, for people who think about ethics, there's a tendency to want to find the origin and push blame on like, this is when it all went wrong and these are the people who did it. But I'm sort of, realizing it's like, it doesn't really work like that. Certainly there are obvious fraudsters and people that are culpable all the time and commit massive amounts of frauds and should be, imprisoned. But when you look at something as big and complex as the dollar, it's really challenging to do that.
Yeah.
Or the people are just like long dead, so it's like, so how do you roll it back?
Yeah, I don't agree. I don't think you can pinpoint the blame on any one person or group, but it's like, it sort of happens in these little incremental encroachments where it's like, oh, this one bank will print more dollars and it has gold in reserve. And maybe it represents that it actually has more gold than it does. And the whole thing just snowballs. But the point, I mean, and this is the way I'm thinking of Bitcoin lately, it's like humanity really requires this incorruptible, quote unquote, incorruptible money. Like, I know it's probabilistic and it's not perfect, but it's the damn closest thing we've ever had to being incorruptible. I think we require something like that to really get to the next leg of civilization. Otherwise, we're just going to repeat this, boom and bust cycle on top of gold, fighting over it. And there's recently this guy on Twitter. I don't know if you've seen him. He's a U.S. Space Force guy, and he's calling Bitcoin a weapons grade war deterrent protocol. So he's saying that nations throughout history have basically been engaging in the proof of work of warfare to determine who owns what property. And that the whole thing is premised on property that can be violently confiscated. So Bitcoin is this new form of or confiscation resistant property could upend that whole game.
The only problem is you'd have to get states to use Bitcoin, and I don't know. I don't know if I see it. Maybe, right? Maybe, but when you have the nuclear codes, like, what do you even price a Bitcoin? Like, imagine you take all the wealth that exists in fiat and then you push that into Bitcoin. Like, first off, like, how much is Bitcoin worth at that point? I'm pretty sure the ledger security model doesn't hold up under those conditions. So like, we have to reevaluate the whole security system of
in what ways?
System.
In what ways would the security model break down?
Well, it's like, okay, so like the average person storing Bitcoin on a ledger, let's say they have like 10 Bitcoin on here, they're rich, right? This person's rich, or they have 21 Bitcoin on here. Like, maybe how much is that now? That's like not even $1 million, right? So once you're storing like I don't even know, like trillions or billions on that little device, I'm pretty sure there are still vulnerabilities to the software if you're physically in contact with it, right? So now it's just a matter of finding the ledgers. It's like Ledger had this
oh, you mean the specifically the Ledger wallet? I thought you were talking about the Bitcoin ledger. No,
I just mean the infrastructure, not the actual, like, I mean the infrastructure around our like key storage specifically. The chain is good. I'm sold on the chain being good. Well, unless in my theoretical problem here, some of the money flows into like, I don't know who the richest person, like the 10 richest people in the world are, but like maybe they would conceivably have enough money to 51% attack the network. If the wealth of fiat is truly very centralized, and then we just push that all into Bitcoin, then maybe that would create a weakness in it. I don't know, but dude.
Yeah, that's
anyway.
Interesting. I don't know. Well, it just seems like I don't know. Call it an informed intuition, maybe, but it's like my study of history is we keep breaking the money protocol, and that leads to all these negative consequences violence and civilizational collapse. Like, we needed some substrate or some foundation that nobody can mess with to build a higher civilization, to scaffold to something that we haven't done yet. And I hope that is Bitcoin.
I hope that when, Bitcoin sees more success than it's already seen, that the existing group of Bitcoiners decides to do something like meaningful and productive with that transfer of wealth.
Yeah. Well, there's definitely been many personal transformations inspired by Bitcoin, but to your earlier point, not everybody treats it that way. So I guess we shall see.
We shall see, but it'll be a fun ride.
Yeah. Well, Kiara, thank you so much for coming on and talking to me. If you just want to let the audience know where they can find you and where they can find the book.
Yeah, so you can get the book on Amazon. I'd recommend the paperback. I think that's the best formatted version of it. And you can find me on Twitter. I tweet a little bit here and there. I'm doing some YouTube videos every now and then, but my DMs are open, and I really appreciate doing the podcast and just ranting about, beauty, truth, goodness, history, like very meta, very fun. Always a good time to talk.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun. Very much my style. So thanks for that.